good. Suits me.
I always like to have a useful prop.
You should have brought this in.
Huh.
Don't mind if you do.
So we had Peter here to discuss his book some time ago.
Put it on display. See the score go up on Amazon.
We're past that stage.
You probably could do with redoing that look in some ways.
Well, it's out in paperback now. It has been for a while, so I thought they can get it much cheaper.
You don't want to discourage hardback sales now. We've got a few minutes to go.
Good. How are you doing?
Just out of curiosity, are you involved in the Electric Transportation Association meetings here next week?
I'm not. I live up in New Hampshire, actually, and so no, but the answer is no. Should I be?
I don't know, well, I saw it on the web, and we have a parade of electric cars and then all sorts of sessions.
I'm afraid I will not get educated.
Wait just a second more. Ah, Komatsu.
Isn't that a beautiful model?
Yeah, I feel a little better from Caterpillar.
Caterpillar's still in there.
Yeah, these, and for some reason, it's been effective, I guess, for the John Deere has gotten into not only decent models, but T-shirts and hats and so forth. You can pick up these catalogs you get in the mail, and you have a whole
But
page
as that
of
Porsche
John
does,
Deere.
I mean, I guess
Yeah.
John Deere has they all have their demographic group that likes their stuff. To sell it.
So I must say I'm jealous about you being at MIT. That is just a bubbling font of great stuff.
Fun place to be, especially if you do energy things right now. So.
Oh, yes. Well, I just read Richard Lester had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, really?
2 days ago saying why we're not over nuclear power, and so talked about the research agenda.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I think the whole world would love to pick MIT up and move it to there.
Whatever kind. Well, I mean, that's what a lot of schools try to do. You know, they partner with MIT and try to open up.
I believe you've got some partnerships with Tsinghua.
Yeah, the biggest one I would say is with Singapore, which makes sense given how Singapore brings, they send their smartest people and then bring them back and they have them. But yeah, they're opening up. It's not quite MIT in Singapore, but it's something like that. Call it SMART. It's like Singapore MIT something. I forget what the rest of it stands for. Yeah.
Well, why don't we get started? Thank you all for coming. This is I think, a tribute to our speaker that we have so many people on what is the most beautiful day in Washington for some time. We really are blessed in more than one way today. My name is Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the Wilson Center on America and the global economy. Let me just say a word or two about the Wilson Center for those of you who are new to us. The Congress in 1968 wanted to honor Woodrow Wilson, and they decided against one more marble statue, one more monument on the mall, and instead decided to create this living memorial which is designed to bring together both sides of Wilson's life. As you may know, Wilson was the only American president to have had a PhD. In his era, he was quite a prominent political scientist. Went on to be president of Princeton, two-term president, prior to that, governor of New Jersey. So the Congress gave us the assignment of bringing together people who are doing the best thinking about policy together with people who are making or influencing policy. And we do it here in Washington. We do it at times around the country and even at times overseas. And in that spirit, we have two very good thinkers with us today, as well as quite a number of good thinkers assembled in the audience here. It's a great pleasure to welcome Peter Huber back to the Wilson Center. We had him here, was it 6 years ago now, Peter, to discuss his book, The Bottomless Well. He's the author of quite a number of books. He is currently, and has been, I think, for some time, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which, it's based in New York. I think he does a lot of his work here in Washington.
Not anymore.
Not anymore? You are in New York?
No, I'm in New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Oh, well, that opens up a whole other realm of possibilities. New Hampshire is, southern New Hampshire, as you might know, is home to a lot of innovative activity, including DECA, which is Dean Kamen's entrepreneurial business. We had the great pleasure of having Peter here 6 years ago to talk about his book, The Bottomless Well, which I certainly recommend to you. Enjoyed it thoroughly. And he, I must say, we could easily describe him as a bottomless well of provocative ideas. We're also very fortunate to have with us Max Parnes, am I right? Is that correct, Max? Who has a good deal of experience having worked in China for the NRD, National Resources Defense Council. He is an electrical engineer by background, and he's now at MIT working on the energy question there, and he'll provide some erudite commentary on Peter's presentation. So I've asked Peter really to make a full presentation, but make sure we have lots of time for questions. And Max will then provide 10 minutes or so of commentary, and then we'll open it up for questions and dialogue. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This being a political town, let me start with some political confessions or disclaimers or explanations. I'm basically a conservative. I don't expect most of you would agree with most of what I think on most issues, and I certainly, most of the people I talk to wouldn't either.
Peter, you've forgotten that we are the real Fox.
Yes,
we are fair and balanced.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I'm here. But with that said, I don't actually believe that electric cars will sell unless there is a free market case for it. I think the right. I was surprised because I'm in favor of electric cars, in case you're guessing still. But the right, some of the more right-wing media wanted me on to talk about this short paper I've written, and they were just horrified by what I said. They obviously hadn't read the paper, and they were quite shocked when I actually expressed my views. And I got to tell you, my sympathies are with them, even though I think they're not quite up to speed on this one. I mean, I will say right here and now, we on the free market side have seen so many just truly stupid, foolish efforts to tax and subsidize and prescribe what we drive and what fuels it and who builds it, that many of us who trust markets or many of my friends who trust markets fear that if they say a single kind word about the electric car, we'll soon be subsidizing a search for lithium under the cornfields of Iowa or something equally stupid. I mean, there's a strong, visceral political hatred of electric cars, which I actually would like to help dispel. All right, and so here in two sentences is what I believe about the market forces. First of all, I believe that market forces. And this is, you can tune out right after this. I mean, I'm going to elaborate on this, but this is the whole story. I think market forces are steadily moving vehicles toward the electric grid, and I believe that given half a chance, which it has not been given, and it may never be given, the grid will move substantially toward the electric vehicle, and they may even close the gap. Okay, so that's what I try and tell my conservative friends. And first of all. Here's a vehicle that in real life is a model of one, is much, much bigger than a Hummer. I've stood beside one, and my head comes up to about the hubcap here, okay? And it's also even more hybrid electric than a Prius. Komatsu's monster mining truck, is powered by a huge diesel generator, and all the rest is electric, right down to these 12-foot wheels. truth be told, it won't win any friends at the NRDC or Greenpeace. It is used mainly for mining coal, but Komatsu had other reasons for building it this way. Electric drivetrains are cheaper to manufacture. They move much more power in much smaller, lighter systems. They move it faster and more precisely and reliably. They require a lot less maintenance. And in the right conditions, yes, they also burn a lot less fuel, which matters when you're moving payloads that are this big. And this truck is not a weird anomaly. General Electric's biggest locomotive, also used mainly for hauling coal, has a gigantic onboard generator, powers everything else right down to the wheels. The latest ships that the Navy has on the drawing board are all electric, right down to the guns. Yes, you can fire a shell electrically too, and they do. Okay, and passenger cars are heading that way, step by little step. Engineers are now rapidly electrifying the water and oil pumps and the radiator cooling fans and the brakes and the engine valves, and almost every peripheral system under your hood is going electric. And as I'll sort of get back to shortly, I think market forces alone, all right? And I'm excluding carbon taxes, anything that my friend and colleague here, or almost colleague, I once removed, we were both at MIT for a while, we didn't overlap, but anyway, I think market forces alone, without taxes, without Washington money, so will take the car a lot more electric. You will be driving a hybrid electric, even if even all my most conservative friends will as well. Before we go further on how the car, I think, will inevitably evolve, and I used to be a mechanical engineer. It doesn't give me joy to say that the electrical engineers own this now, but they will soon enough. But here are the basics, and I want to listen carefully, because if you don't, you'll misunderstand me completely. But if we could connect the wheels of our cars, I mean the wheels themselves, directly into the grid today, if we could, while barreling down the highway, plug them into the grid, we certainly would, and we'd never buy gasoline again. I mean, there's really no doubt, I think, about that. At current retail prices, with current technologies, and I'm jumping over the details, but they can are easily verified. The grid would provide electric miles at the equivalent of about $1 a gallon, and if electricity were priced by market forces rather than by regulators, as low as maybe 30 cents a gallon. This is not the onboard storage. This is if we could put the motors on the wheels and just plug it right into the grid. Grid electricity is so cheap because the gigantic furnaces and boilers, that spin million horsepower turbines in power plants are much more efficient, certainly, than the average dinky little piston engine that you've got under your hood, all right? And they're also, grid electricity is much cheaper because almost none of it in these huge furnaces burns oil. All of it burns much cheaper fuels. The expensive part, of course, is getting the electricity from the curb to those wheels. In fact, it's so expensive that very few people, in my view, would buy today's plug-in electric cars, even if grid electricity were free. In the handful of plug-in electrics currently in production, most of the cost of moving the electricity from the grids lies in the battery, the big battery packs. The batteries alone cost something in the range of $10,000. Obviously, this varies, but I'm giving you the right ballpark. And they weigh about 1,000 pounds. And then this gets us then to the next question. How much battery you really need, to make an electric car practical and convenient will also depend in some measure, and this we have to find out, but, how fast you can charge it and how easy it is to find the next charging station. I mean, that has to come into the equation somehow. We don't know exactly how, but it's going to be part of the story. We can certainly imagine a future of electric cars with much smaller batteries than is currently contemplated, that cost and weigh a lot less, these batteries, but that are supported by a grid that allows drivers to pump in maybe 50 miles or 100 miles of 50 cent a gallon equivalent electricity in minutes rather than hours, almost anywhere that drivers care to stop. I mean, you can picture this. I'm not saying we've got it, far from it, but it's as a technical matter, I'm not saying anything outlandish here. The batteries we know best today are designed to be charged slowly, but they can be designed to charge a lot faster. I mean, in a nutshell, and this doesn't take a very technical mind, charging a very small battery can be done quickly, right? There isn't much there. If you make 50,000 of these and very small and put them in the right array and charge them in parallel, you may have some cooling issues and so on, but it can be done. It's a technically surmountable problem, and there are companies working on it very actively today. So you obviously have some kind of trade-off between, how much you try and invest in the grid and how much you try and invest in the car. Now, there's more to this story, and this many people just won't believe me when I say it. So go off and look at the numbers, and maybe you'll challenge me on this. On the grid side, and again, I'm a lawyer too, and I choose my words carefully. So before you say he's dead wrong, listen carefully. All right, on the grid side, we could easily push up voltages to accommodate fast charging systems. I mean, grid is great with high voltages. They know how to go really, really high. Okay, and if you go high enough, you can push power into anything very, very fast. I mean, and you have to upgrade the last mile of the grid. I mean, the stuff nearest to the curb. That you could begin burning out quite quickly. You have to the nearby wires and transformers. You have to upgrade, and or else as soon as you plug in your fast charging electric car, you'll black out the neighborhood, and then your greenest neighbors just won't love you as much as you had hoped. But if electric car companies and grid companies could collaborate closely enough and get the grid out ahead here, I think it very likely that car companies would move more aggressively and rapidly to meet them halfway. I mean, at the moment, they're designing cars largely on the assumption that they'll be plugging them into something like a 110-volt socket or something not much higher. I think this is an area where the grid, if it's going to meet them halfway, almost certainly has to come first, and that makes it distinctly different from what we had in our computer, move from a narrow band to a much faster network. The computers came first. They were valuable standalone, right, before they were all networked. With the electric cars, I mean, if grid changes are going to play a substantial role, they will have to be leading or at least evolving in very close tandem with the cars, or this dynamic process won't happen at all. How far will the cars go on their own? As engineers progressively electrify the peripheral systems under the hood, they build out a new onboard network of switches and wires and transformers, and this takes some serious re-engineering as it is, and they have to install at least a somewhat larger battery to make sure that all the electric peripherals stay lit when the engine is running slowly or not at all. And as they build up this onboard electric grid, it gets increasingly easy to extend it just a little bit further and electrify things a little bit more. They're just those economies. That's just how things work in any network, even in a small network under the hood of a vehicle. For example, I mean, and this is the easy one, and the economics are easy, everything is easy. The car engine is idle so much of the time that, mechanical engineers have turned idle into a verb and are very proud about how smoothly their engines run when they're doing nothing useful at all, when they're just sitting still. Add a bit more battery and a better starter motor, which many companies are already doing, and you can quickly turn off the car engine whenever the car stops moving. And in urban traffic, that alone saves quite a bit of fuel. That's the light hybrids. Lots of companies are building them today, making them today, and for many drivers, they make good economic sense today without carbon taxes, cap and trade, or anything. It just is a good way to design an urban car, all right? And they will get cheaper because there are always huge economies of scale on this. And then you have the brakes. In most cars today, of course, the brake's job is to throw energy overboard, sometimes as quickly as you possibly can. But it's quite easy to recapture energy from a spinning wheel if you're able to take the energy back in the form of electricity. I mean, electric generators love spinning wheels. They're just made for each other. So maybe you put in a little bit more battery to interface with what what the industry calls regenerative braking. I mean, it's a good engineering call, again, incrementally. And from there on out, and this is where you begin discussing how much further the market will go, but from there on out, you can add more battery and then a bit more until, roughly speaking, you get the hybrid electric car that runs full-time as efficiently as it would run otherwise only when cruising at steady speed down the highway. And that, as anybody knows who's bought a car and seen the 2 mileage things, is a big improvement, okay? Whether going all the way makes economic sense today is very much less clear, okay? The first several steps, I think the economics are clear today. How much further you go down this road gets increasingly, more debatable. But as cars move in that direction, step by little step, the possibility of using grid power to top off whatever onboard battery you have gets just increasingly attractive. And if batteries get big enough or easy enough to recharge, then maybe, only maybe, and this is highly uncertain from an unsubsidized economic perspective, finally you throw out the engine completely and you rely entirely on grid power. And one or two sort of pretty bold manufacturers think they can go there today. I expect they will regret that. I think they've tried to get well out ahead of the curve, but we'll find out. All we know at the moment, from a purely economic perspective, and again, I exclude your environmental economics, which many people on the political right will exclude for you, like it or not. What we know at the moment is that creating a serious market for electric miles, if it can be done at all, will depend on significant investment in both cars and the grid. And when I say significant, think 13 digits. The stakes are a couple of $1 trillion of investment, some on the car side, some on the grid side. The two sides obviously work together, but up to the point, they're also substitutes for other. If you put, let us say, and these are entirely hypothetical numbers, but if you put an extra $100 billion in the grid side, perhaps that lets you invest, say, $300 billion less on the car side. And I stack the numbers that way, not evenly, in other words, because the grid is a shared resource, and your car isn't. An extra dollar invested in the grid can be used to recharge a lot of cars. An extra dollar invested in your car probably won't be. If you go with more grid and less battery in this balance, you also make the car lighter, and then it needs less battery because a lighter battery doesn't have to haul around so much heavy battery from the get-go. So there is a kind of a self-accelerating process here, but it'll only take you so far. Now, just to get some other numbers, and numbers get tedious, but if you don't do these, you're not going to go there. The president's proposal in the State of Union address was to get 1 million electric cars on the road in the next 4 years. And at today's prices, that means spending about $10 billion on car batteries. They might get cheaper, but that's what we'd be talking about. Ramp that up to 100 million cars, less than half the U.S. fleet, and that's $1 trillion in batteries under the hood of cars. That's a fair chunk of money, even in the city. And that capital will stand idle about 90% of the time because most cars are only driven a few hours a day. So from an economic terms, investing $1 trillion that's not, idle 90% of the time is a tough place to start. Great, say a lot of electric car enthusiasts. That's what gives drivers lots of time to recharge these batteries, right? They're sitting still all the time. But no way, says most of the rest of America, I believe, because we don't have $10,000 to spare for a battery, and now and again we drive 10 hours at a stretch with only short pit stops. Now, on the grid side, and I think this is the least discussed fact, and again, I choose my words carefully, on the grid side there's even more idle capital. But it has already been invested. It's already there. The power plants and wires already built would have a replacement cost of several $1 trillion. Most of your monthly electric bill is for capital, not fuel. It's not the cost of the incremental cost of the fuel. It's in the stuff you can drop on your foot that's very heavy and that doesn't burn. Okay, except in Japan. But anyway, on average, that capital stands idle about half the time, all of it, end to end, on average. Okay, if we could choose the best time and best place to plug in our cars, idle capacity in existing power plants could power almost all the miles we drive in all of America in the light-duty vehicles, all right? The excess capacity is there because the grid has to stay lit, even in mid-afternoon on the very hottest day of the hottest summer in the decade. The grid just can't be allowed to go down very often because when the grid goes down, it takes almost everything down with it. So it's from that perspective, ridiculously over-engineered. But batteries are the one thing that don't need an always-on grid. Quite the contrary, rechargeable batteries are widely deployed to stockpile grid power and kick it back out when, on the rare occasions, the grid does fail. So, if you happen to own $1 billion or $5 billion of generating capacity, or a transmission line, which can cost as much, or a citywide distribution networks, batteries are extremely attractive customers, or at least they should be in a rational world, okay? They are the customers that are eager to buy the readily available power that nobody else wants right at this minute, but that everyone else has already paid for or soon will, okay? And when a battery plugs into your grid, in a rational, market-driven world, you would be just delighted. You would have a strong incentive to pump power into that battery as fast as you possibly could because idle capacity in the grid is like an empty seat on a jumbo jet. It's a highly perishable good. You use it now or you lose it. Yes, to unload it fast, you have to upgrade the last mile of the grid, okay? That you can't unload it very fast with the existing last mile infrastructure, but upgrading that mile will cost a tiny amount compared with what you might earn by making profitable use of all the idle capacity and the other 1,000 miles of wire that you own and in your power plants too. That relatively modest new investment from an electric company's perspective lets you compete head-to-head in the roughly $300 billion market for oil that we currently put into our light passenger vehicles. And if you want to put a 300, look, this is the electric companies, if this world converges around them, can go make a play for $300 billion of oil that's currently been put into our cars. The entire retail electric market today in the United States is generating $350 billion a year. So this is an enormous, it should be an enormously attractive opportunity for people who already own these assets and already have somebody else paying for them in full. If you're trying to choreograph all this from Washington, the path of least political resistance is certainly the wishful battery future. Throw money at batteries and at the people who are willing to buy a huge battery and wrap a tiny car around it, and count on the grid somehow or other to be there and provide or be instructed to provide by utility regulators. What's needed at tariff prices approved by regulators when necessary. First of all, tariffs can't provide the on-the-fly pricing flexibility that lies at the heart of an efficient and economically efficient scheme for using idle capacity. When available to serve flexible customers like batteries, the closest analog of the pricing structure we need here is the extremely dynamic and complex pricing process that airlines use to price seats on a jumbo jet. You have a big capitalized asset, and believe me, they've invested enormous amounts in getting that right, because there are enormous economies to capture in being very dynamic in those prices. When your prices are set by utility commissions, and here's the second big problem, and I think it's the killer here. I've worked with utilities for a very long time as a lawyer, and when your prices are set by utility commissions, not electric utilities, by the way, phone companies, but getting out of demand when you are regulated by a utility commission is very perilous, okay? If you make smart investments that lower costs, regulators are very quick to push the savings down to the ultimate consumers. When things work out badly, there's tremendously strong political pressure to pass losses on to shareholders. And in that world, without a stake in the upside, utilities have every reason to let car companies and drivers take the lead. But the car companies and drivers have every reason to wait for someone to build out a charging infrastructure before they go anywhere close to that. And at best, this standoff will push you toward the world of big batteries in the car that can be charged only slowly through the existing assets if you can find a charging station close enough to where you need it. And at worst, this just sets the stage for never going there at all. And if I had to, because I'm getting somewhat cynical about politics, my guess is that that's the most likely outcome at this point, unless we think of something radically different, because I just don't. So that gets me to where to what I think we should do. I may be the only person in the country who believes this. We have actually dealt with a rather similar problem before, and I built a law firm around this and spent 25 years working on it. As you're reminded every time you pay your phone and cable bills, our broadband digital networks were deployed not by Silicon Valley, not by small startups, but by the old guard telecom companies. Silicon Valley provided the brilliant hardware, but whether you're trying to transport terabits of data or gigawatts of power, turning hardware into a far-flung physical network requires big company coordination. It requires fleets of trucks and legions of technicians and installers and hard-hat employees out on the street. There are huge economies of scale and scope, big opportunities to mobilize existing assets to upgrade things. I mean, that's just the reality of very big networks. There are no shortcuts in that. In the digital domain, and this is a matter of historical legal fact, if that's not too oxymoronic, in the digital domain, it took Washington about 30 years to accept that rather pedestrian economic fact that if we were going to build out broadband digital networks, they would be built by the existing network companies. From the dawn of the mainframe computer in the 50s until well into the 1980s, most digital traffic was funneled through phone lines and switches that had been deployed to carry voice traffic. The FCC and the antitrust police, I worked with them all, had a policy of maximum separation between computers and online services on the one hand and the networks that might link them all together. There was unfortunate choice of word, there was a sort of regulatory apartheid between these two. They simply were not to mix anyway at all. Washington announced that it would not regulate the computer and content side at all. It told state regulators they couldn't either. It preempted the whole field on the computer and the online service bit. No taxes, no subsidies, no mandates, no content regulation, no nothing. And in the network side, on the other hand, everything, terms of service, prices, corporate structures, business alliances, remained tightly regulated in tariff for the better part of 30 years, from the dawn of the mainframe to the early 1990s. To simplify the story just a bit, the broadband networks just didn't get built until the maximum separation policy was largely dismantled, which allowed digital networking services to join computers and online services on the deregulated side of the divide. Then and only then, the old guard telecom companies reinvented their corporate culture. It was a sight to behold. They mobilized the resources to transform the old narrowband voice phone services and the old one-way analog cable services into digital broadband. And while they were at it, they built out new wireless networks from scratch and are now broadbanding those as well. Conspicuous by their absence in this story are the companies that own the most valuable spectrum of all. They're the broadcasters, because they remain largely sort of quarantined by the regulatory structure that was enacted in 1928. So why not try the same again with electricity? Deregulate what I might call broadband electricity. That's obviously not the right technical word, but let's say retail electric power above 7 kilowatts through a single outlet. Let the wire and power plant companies collaborate together however they like with each other and with companies that build batteries and cars and anything else. Let them provide broadband electricity, not under tariff, but under private contracts with municipalities and employers and mall owners and parking garages and homeowners and anyone else. And make sure that the new contract services aren't cross-subsidized by the old tariff services. That's a political must, but it's feasible. Exactly the same thing was done in the telecom area. But beyond that, let these companies pocket all the profits, every last dime they might earn using otherwise idle capacity in the wires in the power plants that they already own. Where might all this lead? Look, you work it all out. Us conservatives say, well, that's what the market is supposed to tell us. But at least if we take this step, you unleash the forces that will let the market answer this. And I am actually very optimistic about this. There are enormous profits to be made out of charging batteries if you can do it at marginal cost, but earn market-based prices. And you will mobilize private capital, which of course, Washington has no capital left at all. We could discuss where that leads. I think it would lead rapidly to the development of the smart grid, okay? Because you can't do this and you can't have intelligent pricing unless you deploy communication network. We'll have some dissent from the floor, okay? And it would have to lead to upgrades in the last mile of the grid and also in the long distance transportation structure for reasons we can discuss. Anyway, there we have it from there are ways to hope to subsidize and tax and carbon permit your way to this. I don't think they have the political mileage in them anymore.
Thank you, Peter. As we suggested, another provocative set of ideas, thought-provoking from the bottomless well. Max, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much. Peter, I'd like to thank you for very interesting and queued up several things that I'm going to try to talk a little bit about in responding to your points. And I put together a few slides here that I'm going to go through, kind of talk over. There's some useful graphs in there. And I'm going to talk about environment, batteries, and infrastructure in 10 minutes with 5 slides. So it's going to be a feat. So look, I'm going to play Mythbusters here a little bit and open it up. One thing that people frequently talk about is electric vehicles kind of as a cure-all for transportation emissions. This is a graph from Electric Power Research Institute and Natural Resources Defense Council, disclaimer, my former employer. And what you have here, what you should be looking at is, so here on the x-axis we have different generation technologies, and on the y-axis we have emissions. So if you care about emissions, what you should be looking at are these yellow bars. These yellow bars tell you this is how much greenhouse gases emissions that we get when we charge using these different electric power ways to produce. So for instance, look at this. Here's a hybrid vehicle. Like Peter was saying, with a hybrid you get regenerative braking. There's a few other efficiency gains in there just from having a small battery. But if you're using a battery for propulsion, you have to charge it with electricity, and that electricity comes from somewhere. So if you're concerned about climate, boy, look at that. If you charge an electric vehicle with old coal, you have worse emissions than if you're just driving a conventional hybrid with a small battery. On the other hand, if you do it with nuclear or carbon capture or renewables, you do a lot better. So this is one thing that I frequently hear brought up kind of in policy areas, that electric vehicles are going to greatly reduce our emissions. That could be the case, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit, kind of remind everybody that electricity is coming from somewhere. Like Peter said, there are big efficiency gains that you get from using a 300 megawatt or 500 megawatt coal-fired power plant instead of pistons in your engine. But it's simply not the case that electric vehicles are always better than a small hybrid, for instance. Depends on where your electricity comes from. So makes this a little trickier question, I think. And maybe we could talk about, you have to tie it into RPS or something. But this was one thing I wanted to bring up. So another thing Peter was talking about were battery costs. Battery costs, when you talk with automotive manufacturers and speaking with them, we had at MIT a symposium where we had all different automotive manufacturers and people who manufacture batteries for that application. Utilities came. This was last April, and we issued a report on it. And what came out, I mean, look at this. So this is what year we're looking at, different projections, and this is battery pack cost in dollars per kilowatt hour. Kilowatt hour is how much energy a battery holds. So you want low prices. But here's all these projections. We have projections from NRC. We have some from Air Resources Board in California. This guy right here at around $300 per kilowatt hour, that's United States Advanced Battery Consortium. They say that's the price you need to get to in order to have a vehicle that is price competitive, 40-mile electric range, with a conventional vehicle. So, we're talking about this free market path to vehicle electrification, and to me it seems important that consumers be interested in buying this vehicle. And I think an important part of getting consumer buy-in is producing a very affordable vehicle. And, for instance, the Nissan Leaf, which is, a brand new pure electric vehicle that just came out, its battery size is around 24 kilowatt hours. So you do the multiplication. Nissan or any battery manufacturer, anybody with a battery, they'll never tell you exactly what their price is. They kind of keep that close to their chest. But you can see that there's a very wide spread in these. Different people predict different things. Battery manufacturers will tell you something completely different. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think it's going to make it hard to kind of see where the market is going. But again, with a high battery cost, consumers aren't going to be interested in buying an electric vehicle, no matter how easy it is for them to charge it. I think you have to have a low-cost vehicle in order for people to want to buy it. Of course, there will always be some people who are interested in electric vehicles because maybe they view it as positioning as a luxury vehicle, positioning it as more environmentally friendly, and so on and so forth. But batteries are expensive, and it's hard to say where the price is going. You can see there's a big variation. Okay, so Peter was talking about this a lot, infrastructure, and this is the area that my research really focuses on a lot. I have a lot that I want to say about this. So, there's so many interesting issues that come up. Range anxiety is one of the things that Peter addressed. So, in getting consumer buy-in, people have to feel like, I have this vehicle and I'm going to have a place to charge it. I'm not going to go out for a nice drive on Sunday and then run out of electricity and have to push it home. That's range anxiety, worrying about running out of charge. So, how many charging stations and where? Now, there's all different ways to do this. Right now, there's a few companies that are help setting these up. They do studies. They ask people, where would you like charging stations? It's difficult to tell where people actually need them, and sometimes it's counterintuitive. Let me tell you a story. You would think a great place to do vehicle electrification would be in a place that leverages things that electric vehicles are good at, like stop-and-go driving. So, for instance, Manhattan. Great place. Sometimes you can't move. Sometimes you're driving. But actually, it turns out that most people have private cars in New York. They use them for driving, on the weekend to take a trip somewhere. And electric vehicle batteries aren't big enough for that anyway. So, surprise! It turns out that there's a lot of interesting twists and turns to this, and figuring out where to put that infrastructure, how much, who pays. That's another important issue. As Peter alluded to, there's different rates that you can charge at. Level 1 charging is kind of almost like you plug it into your wall. Level 2, these are standards, I should say, these two guys. There's level 1, level 2, and there's level 3. The standard for that isn't set yet. It's set by the Society of Automotive Engineers. But level 3 isn't there yet. but it's not cheap. Look at these costs, right? So if I'm going to buy an electric vehicle and I want to be able to charge it in any kind of timely fashion, on top of the vehicle costs, which are higher than normal because of the cost of the battery, I also have this additional cost of installing the plug at home. And you can see it's not necessarily a small number. There's also some inconvenience with it. You have to have an electrician come, and in doing that, there's permitting as well. Public is another beast. Setting up those charging stations in parking lots, side of the road, it's it can be quite pricey. Those numbers, this $3,000 and $4,500, that's capital costs. There's also costs with installing, which involves maybe trenching, so you have to dig a wire. So I have another slide with a few more infrastructure things. Peter I thought was doing a great job of talking about how do we make sure that the impact on the grid isn't too big. We don't want blown fuses. EPRI, which is the Electric Power Research Institute, they're kind of research arm of the electric power industry. They've been looking at this a lot. Mark Duval has written a lot of interesting papers on this. Their biggest concern seems to be transformers. So they're worried if all of a sudden your block has 3 new electric vehicles on it, all on the same transformer, it's going to age out faster. And that has to do with transformers were originally designed to cool off overnight. So while there's a lot of spare generation capacity at night, you may have to do some upgrades in your distribution, which is lower voltage, because these transformers are used to being able to cool down. And if you're charging 3 electric vehicles on them, they're not going to cool down, they're going to stay hot. And that's going to shorten their lifespan. That said, whenever I talk with utilities, and I've talked with quite a few in the course of my research, they are very involved in this issue. They always have a person who works on electric vehicles, at least one. They're excited because it could be a new great source of income for them. And right now, though, they're not so worried about widespread impact. And this goes back to the consumer cost issue. There's just not that many electric vehicles being sold right now. So they're not worrying about having to do a rate case in front of the PUC to say, oh, we need to upgrade our infrastructure because electric vehicles are coming. If you read the rate-making cases that are going on right now, the biggest fight is for advanced metering. And sometimes in the course of doing the advanced metering rate-making cases, they'll mention electric vehicles. But my point here is that utilities aren't thinking about widespread deployment right now. They don't see it as an issue. And finally, one last point. Peter advocated that we should do a lot of deregulation. That could certainly help because there's lots of problems with different regulations from municipality to municipality and from PUC to PUC. I'll give you an example. In California, there was a court case where there was argument between a few different utilities and ratepayer advocates and environmental people. And the fight was basically this. So you have an electric vehicle charging station, and you want to make money from it. How do you do that? Well, you could sell electricity. That seems to be the most straightforward way of doing it. Well, there's a catch. If you sell electricity, you're regulated as a utility. And, Joe Schmo who has set up a few charging stations because he thought it could be a good idea, doesn't really want to deal with that onerous regulation and legal issues that come up with that. So there was a big argument going on in California, which I believe has been resolved. What it came out as is we're not going to regulate charging stations as a utility, which sounds silly because, why would you ever regulate them as a utility? It's just a small charging station. But part of the reasons for that is environmental, cost. There's lots of technicalities that go into that. And that was one state. So now we're going to have to do the same thing in many other states, assuming status quo and that we don't move towards this kind of deregulation. So just to respond to a few points, Peter's directly, I think that if you talk to energy economists or whatever, and you ask them like, oh, should we be moving more towards a market where we have real-time price signals, issues like that? People are for it. But we've been trying to deregulate for quite some time, liberalize power markets and have wholesale markets for power. But we haven't been able to move to it. It's very slow. It's a very slow process. But if we were able to get that real-time pricing, I think it would be great not just for doing storage, but it would also be great in terms of reducing peak demand and many other issues as well. So I think that Peter's arguments fit into kind of a larger scheme of issues with the grid that people are looking at right now. It's a great place to be, and I wanted to put in a final plug for a report that we help work on, and it addresses these issues in great detail. So if you're interested in learning more, there was a symposium that we hosted. So check out that website. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Matt.
I'm going to go back to this.
Before we go to questions, would you like a word or two in
just
response?
very, very briefly, and first of all, I know it's a sign of getting old, but I'm delighted that I lived long enough to actually agree with, quite heartily, in fact, with a lot of what NRDC or even a former NRDC said, because I didn't used to at all. So this is progress or age or something. Just a couple of things. The World Wildlife Fund, or they've got a different name in Europe, also did a big study on this. It's called Plugged In. It came out last year. And their conclusion, and I'm not sure it's right, their conclusion was even in Indiana, which is about 80% coal or so, they actually thought it was marginally greener to go to the electric. Now, I'm not sure their numbers are right. It depends. But I will say this. Here's what's actually sort of gently wrong with this. We're burning about 3 billion barrels of oil a year, if you go back to the source in our cars today. If you want to compare things, I'm almost sure of this, that if you took all that oil, which would be stupid in my view, and burned it in a big electric power plant, you would and then push the electricity, right? You would substantially reduce emissions. I mean, the hybrids and the light hybrids are very efficient, but nobody can beat a 1 million horsepower turbine and external combustion. And by the way, once you've got it there, you can really regulate the hell out of it, right? I mean, emissions controls and all that, which you really can't do.
That's what Max had in mind, actually.
Okay, but secondly, and this I actually think really does frame how we, come from different worlds and so on. But here's the only way I ever thought of this was by, I'm going to educate generations of Hubers on what I did for the phone companies here. I mean, believe me, they all go to college on it, right? Look, most of you didn't pay for most of this, okay? There's absolutely no reason why most of you should pay for the. And by the way, much of the cost of this is that battery in the back, and the electronics go with it. That's a big piece of money in here, and most of you wouldn't have bought them if somebody else hadn't paid. There is no reason. In fact, electric utilities would be. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be paying for the capital that's in your car, or a chunk of it. But there are, by the way, a number of economic models as well that would switch out batteries and so on. But they have a huge incentive to get that infrastructure out there. Look, I'll tell you what it used to be with the phone companies. First of all, in the 50s, this was hardwired in the line, and nobody could touch it. There was a big case called Hushaphone, and if you plugged anything into there, they turned off your service, okay? So that was the old world. Then there was a new world where the phone company couldn't touch these things at all. I mean, you couldn't sell them, you couldn't market them, that was completely on the other side, the deregulated side, along with the computers and so on. And then finally, we got to this world where what? They actually give this thing away to you. If it's cheap enough, my little junky one and your fancy ones, they give you $200 of it, which will more than cover the battery and so on. It's a very attractive model for them in a world where they can sell you the monthly service, okay? They can. There you go, you see?
Timing.
I arranged that, okay? But
Nobody ever calls.
you see, some of us know how to put these things on silent. But anyway, the point being that market forces tend to find these solutions. They don't. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think anybody wants to buy a $10,000 battery in their car. They just don't. And I try not to debate projections because I've heard too many projections by Greens.
See, those projections are all over the place.
Yeah, well, I just don't believe in debating them. And, I also know that even people in very good faith tend to make projections that are tinged by what they hope will happen, or maybe what they hope they'll get subsidized to happen, or if we only invest the first $10 billion from Washington, then the rest will be cheap, It's happened for a long time. I'm old enough, you're not. When you were too young to think about this, in the Carter administration, it was going to be synfuels. We were going to we spent huge amounts of that, Ethanol was everything until, I don't know if NRDC still supports ethanol. I think the numbers are, it was enormously subsidized, and a lot of it on green grounds, and very few people believe that made good environmental sense or anything else anymore. We built that industry. I mean, we have a long record of building industries, that our costs are going to collapse or save the environment and so on. Those things have not been good. That's why I would love to get some people who don't believe in any of that on board too. And markets think of these things. They think of free cell phones. They think of free batteries. They think of sticker shock all the time, believe me. I mean, Verizon will virtually pay you to take one of their data phones, right? I mean, they're soon going to be sending you checks, won't you please change your phone? Because once they've hooked you, they'll pay it back plenty fast. The electric utilities would do that today with batteries.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions. Gentleman here. If you wait, just we have a microphone coming for you.
Hi, I'm Fred Altman, and my question is the direction hybrids are going these days are parallel, which involves a lot of engineering to get both things to the wheel. That, I'm sure, is not a parallel arrangement that all the power goes to the wheels electrically.
There's no parallel to parallel.
What?
There's nothing to parallel. There's no drive shaft.
Right. And it seems strange that there are very few, the Volt being one of them, that is a serial hybrid. I'm curious why there are not more.
I honestly don't know, and I'm not exactly sure how the trade-offs work. If I had to guess, I used to be, as I said, a mechanical engineer, but that was a long time ago. If I had to guess, I suspect it's quite a bit harder to engineer them in parallel to begin with. I mean, you have to, electric motors have to interface with your shaft somehow or other. So I assume markets tend to get these things right. I assume the combination of the economics and the engineering complexity is against it. I mean, the other fact. I mean, I don't know if working with the regenerative braking, which is really where you have to start here, is easier when you're in parallel rather than series. I haven't thought that. I don't know, actually.
Max, do you have a thought?
Yeah. So whenever I talk with mechanical engineers who work on these kind of things, I always hear that parallel tends to be more complicated. And series, there's a benefit to series, which is that they expect that the maintenance costs, there's going to be less breakdowns and things like that. So I think that's one of the things that people are attracted to. And
sorry, I thought it was the other way around. Parallel is well, whatever.
Yeah, basically, serial. If serial has these advantages, why aren't more car companies going to it?
I can't pretend to know what's going on in the minds of GE and the other engineers who are working on that. I think that's above my pay grade.
Something we'll have to look into at a future session. The gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Jerry Asher with the Electric Vehicle Association, Greater Washington, D.C. It's a chapter of the Nationwide Electric Auto Association. My question would be, addressing the vehicle-to-grid concept where you have these electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that can put back time of use when it's most needed into the grid system, buy their battery packs, and possibly earn their owners something like, let's say, several $1,000s. Now, my reference is the University of Delaware. A couple of PhD students were doing this concept, and it's been well received by other utilities like Austin Energy, which would host a vehicle-to-grid conference.
Go ahead first.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I'm familiar with the guy you're talking about, Professor Willett Kempton at University of Delaware. People are divided about V2G, vehicle-to-grid. Personally, I don't like it. There's a few problems, I think, with it. Speaking specifically to the thousands of dollars that people could make back, which I'm very familiar with where those numbers come from. Most of that money comes back in capacity payments from ancillary services markets in the electricity market. And the basic idea behind that is that you get paid not only to provide power, but to be available to provide power. And so you would at least need some kind of aggregation service to put all the vehicles together, because you have to sell in 1 megawatt-hour increments into most ISOs or RTOs. So first you need to put the vehicles together, which needs some kind of aggregation. That costs money. And then there's another issue, which is that, well, let's say that we start equipping all vehicles to be V2G ready, because they're not now. As you get more and more vehicles, the price that you're going to receive per year for providing these services goes down. And eventually I think it gets to a point where people say, hey, I'm not interested in doing this because I like the idea of always having a fully charged battery whenever I want to go. I think that V2G needs buy-in from consumers. Again, I always think that electric vehicles, the consumer needs to want the feature. The consumer needs to want it. So whether consumers want V2G, I think, is an open question.
I have a slightly different take on it, but I reached the same conclusion. As I'm sure you know, utilities have been aware of the diseconomies of non-uniform demand and supply forever. Okay, this is not new to them. They have also worked on load balancing technologies, investments in them forever. I mean, there are lots of ways to store electric power, in other forms. One is you can pump water up a hill, right, and then you run a water turbine later on. You can pump air into coal mines or to big caverns, and you compress it enough, and then you blow it through a turbine later on, okay? Some of them are deploying huge batteries, believe it or not. I think they're using the liquid sodium something or other. They've tried that. None of them have found the economics working, okay? And they have much more attractive economics than any individual car owner has. I mean, again, because they can do things on a very centralized basis. There are additional problems, unlike the broadband data network, electricity is a very hierarchical system, and believe you me, charging stations will be very much a utility issue and very much part of the utility if there are any of them out there. There are none to a first approximation, so zero is never a problem. But any significant numbers, I mean, this is where people are just completely out to lunch. People who are back to dinner, I should say, you get half the populace arriving home in a 2-hour window and plugging in their cars, and the blackout of 2003 was one tree falling on one line north of Cleveland, coupled with a communication infrastructure that said that will black out Manhattan. To this day, the communication infrastructure behind the grid is so primitive, I exaggerate only slightly when I tell you that one person sticking a Pop-Tart in a toaster north of Cleveland can black out Manhattan, okay? I mean, it is a very hierarchical structure, all right? Pumping electricity up, is very much more difficult. In fact, it's impossible with the current infrastructure, okay? You can balance out load on your street. You can keep your home lit off your car. You won't like the economics. I mean, it's a cute idea, but look, this is instinct. I don't have the spreadsheet, but the fact that the big guys were interested in this for a long time and didn't do it is a bad place to start, all right? Because they would love to save that money if they could.
Gentlemen, there.
My name is Ron Minsk. Before I ask my question, I'll add 2 more points to that. And one of them is, the battery manufacturers or the automakers, depending on how it works out, are going to have to warrant these batteries. And it's not clear what taking V to G does to the lives of the batteries. It disrupts their charge cycles. I think there's a substantial issue that if you were the warrantor of the battery, whether or not you would feel it would be appropriate if it was used for something other than what you designed as its primary purpose. If you're having to warrant this battery for 10 years, I think that raises real questions. Second of all, I mean, if you think about it, if the biggest issue with these vehicles is the cost of the battery and the total cost of owning and operating the vehicle, the second biggest one, at least at the moment, probably is the range, as you mentioned. And the range is of such great concern that GM went out and put a whole generator in their vehicle just to relieve range anxiety. The idea that people would be willing to give up range, for 20 cents a kilowatt hour at this point just seems comical when GM is spending $15,000, to build the Volt above the other car. I guess the question that I wanted to ask was, I'm still trying to figure out, given that the total cost of owning and operating these vehicles are substantially higher than the most, than the comparable non-plug-in vehicle. How is it that in the early years, without some type of government intervention or some kind of government incentive, that you actually see these vehicles getting into the marketplace? None of the utilities are stepping up at this point and talking about essentially subsidizing the cost of the vehicle, and it's not clear that consumers would feel comfortable with that model either. People kind of like to know that they own their car.
People kind of, look, first of all, because I believe in markets, I am very skeptical about my ability to tell you, the market will do this or will do that. And I'm even more skeptical of people who tell me, well, if we subsidize it for 10 years, it will then do that, okay? I mean, you can have a lot of faith in that, but then you're much smarter than I am, because I hesitate to say those things. But let me say a couple of things about range, and now I'm going to say things that I'm not qualified to say because I do believe in markets. But look, I really believe the range anxiety is very tightly tied to the ubiquity of charging stations and the speed of charging. I mean, lots and lots of people, ordinary people who don't live inside the Beltway drive 15, 20 miles on a weekend to get to Walmart, or to get to some big mall because they'll save $5 or $10. $4 a gallon fuel is expensive to lots of people, okay? And $1 a gallon miles, the equivalent of miles would be very attractive to many. Sitting still for 8 hours, or 4 hours to get those miles will not be attractive. Sitting still for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, my guess is, I don't know, I think there are lots of people who are going to be stopping for 15 minutes anyway, lots of times during the day, and would be really quite happy they would be really quite pleased with themselves to be getting their $1 a gallon gasoline. I mean, they clip coupons, they do lots of other things. It's a guess.
No, fair enough. So let me ask this question. There's good data that shows the average vehicle drives, far less
Of
than
course.
the battery. We've all kind of seen that data. And we also, you may be familiar, the TEPCO, which we all hear in the news for other reasons, had done a study, I guess it's 2 years ago, and with fast charging around Tokyo, and they put a fleet of vehicles out there, and what they showed was when they initially put the fleet of vehicles out, drivers were suffering from range anxiety. They were coming back with their vehicles essentially not that depleted. I think they were depleting between 20 and 40% of the charge. Then they went out and they put a fast network of fast chargers around Tokyo. And what they found out is the cars were coming back essentially depleting between 60 and 80% of their charge, but they weren't actually using the fast chargers. What it was the knowledge that they could charge if they had to.
Of course.
So in other words, what you've got the problem. So this feeds into another problem, and that is that in any rational model, and most business models that you look at, the payback period on a public charger is far longer than the physical life of the public charger. So you combine that with the problem that the real value of the public charger may be in its existence and not in its use. The knowledge that it's there if you need it, but never having to pay for it. Might you find yourself in a position where you think that actually may be worthy of a public subsidy if that's the real barrier?
Well, again, until I believe those spreadsheets, I would say, have you factored in the fact that we have 50%, more than 50% idle capacity in our wires? Your wires account for roughly 30% of the wires alone, okay, account for roughly 30% of what you're paying in your retail electric bill today, of something like 3 cents on the kilowatt hour, okay? The distribution network alone, the local wires are something close to 2 cents on average, okay? Something like 20%, just the wires. What capacity in that wires is being used? The transformers you'd have to work on. The wire, you're using maybe 10% of that capacity. So all of that is free. I mean, it is free, paid for, or else alternatively, you put more juice through it, you lower the average cost of electricity. Most of these numbers simply do not take into account the huge savings you get by leveling loads. And cars are very attractive. Batteries are very attractive for leveling loads. We actually deploy them for that reason right now. Okay, and if you just look at the cost of your charger and you ask, well, what is the payback period? You're assuming. What are you assuming? That somebody's paying marginally for the cost of that charger? There are people who would love to put those away if they could then pocket 5 or 6 cents on the kilowatt hour for the interruptible power. The last thing I would say is this: look, you talk about range anxiety. To do dynamic pricing, which the market would do, but the utility regulators never will, you are going to have an end-to-end communication network that extends wirelessly to cars on the road. Okay, it has to do that. Otherwise, you will black out Manhattan every time the people leave work, all right? So, that will be built. It can be built at rather low cost. And with dynamic communication, you can very rapidly eliminate range anxiety if there's a fast charging station. You'll never eliminate it if charging is slow.
I think a lot of the excess capacity that you talk about exists when you look at things on the average. So if you look at generating capacity, it's a ton at night. But it's not always the case that there's all that excess capacity at the time when people might be most likely to charge, which is during the peak periods. So there's also a matter of getting the timing right.
Well, but let me answer that. It's another paper, but I've written it too. Okay, it's full 20 minutes. But here's the simple answer: the peaks, okay, track two things overwhelmingly in this country. One is time zone, and the other is weather zone. Okay, those are the two things that push you into the peaks. Weather zones and time zones, you'll notice, are local, okay? We've got 4 time zones in America, and we have weather zones all over the map, and it's very rare that we're all on the same clock, like never, and that we're all in a heat wave, okay? We have a horrendous underinvestment in grid that links it together. And here, just nutshell, the numbers in a nutshell. At any minute in the day, across the country, you look at the wholesale price of electricity, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 cent gaps in the wholesale price of electricity between different points in the country. We can haul that electricity across 1,000 miles for a penny a kilowatt, okay? So you know what? These markets aren't clearing. And they're not clearing because we haven't built grid. And we haven't built grid because it's horribly regulated, okay? We're not averaging out these things. Yes, there will always be some issues on, you know, on everybody doing it at peak, and that means you'll build more power plants eventually. But, you know, we haven't even begun to average things out properly.
Fair enough. Are you willing to help me socialize the cost of spread the cost of the long term, of the long high voltage power lines?
I don't like either socialize or spread, but would I like to give people the appropriate pricing incentives to do that? You bet your life. I would put them right in here, as a matter of fact. Okay, absolutely, but don't make me say socialize or spread. Okay, I'd like investors to get rich doing this. Okay,
there's two things I'd like to respond to. So one thing is we're having an interesting conversation about what do we do with the spare capacity, and I'd like to say, you know, as for whatever reason RPS, you know, because there's an RPS or because price is right, you know, we start introducing more intermittent renewables, specifically wind, into the grid. You know, wind tends to blow strongest at night, and you don't want to ever. It's unpleasant to have to curtail load or curtail supply, you know, if it's available. So a good thing about having some electric vehicles is, hey, there's some extra demand overnight that you can charge. You know, especially if you're doing real-time pricing. I mean, the marginal short-run marginal cost of wind is 0. That's nice. So another point that I want to respond to is. In order to see any real impact on the grid, I mean, you know, even 5% or 10% EV market penetration, you know, you wouldn't see too much. You would see some hotspots, and, you know, the utility would have to deal with those, and it would be a matter of upgrading transformers. But I wouldn't expect to see, you know, big problems, you know, significant problems with blackout or instabilities in frequency or something like that.
We have hard numbers on that. I mean, that's relatively easy. The light vehicles are using 3 billion barrels of oil a year, roughly, round numbers, with a little decimal on that. Okay, the total electric power is being generated with the 7 BBOE, billion barrel of oil equivalents a year. Okay, so of course electric vehicles are having no impact on the grid. There are no electric vehicles. I mean, nobody drives them. Okay, you know, you think if maybe you know 10 people in this city, but believe me, none of them are anywhere else. Okay, there is no market for electric vehicles yet to the first 3 or 4 digits of approximation. Okay, I'd like to help build one.
Let me just jump in and
then there will be an impact. Sorry.
Right. So we have to move there. Go ahead.
Max, you raised a question about the risk to transformers, and Peter, you mentioned that there would probably need to be some upgrading or some research on transformers. Where does that stand? Where are we with regard to? Do we have the technology to make those upgrades? Is it just an investment? So it's just an investment.
Transformers are actually quite easy. I mean, we transform the big power lines transmit 4 gigawatts of power. To put that in perspective, it's 1% of the total U.S. average demand. It gets transformed. Believe me, it's not coming into your house at 756 kilovolts. We know how to step down. we know how to step down voltages. It's not the slightest problem. We don't have when the pole mounted transformers can't support a whole street now that plugs in the car. Okay,
right.
Unless you do it very, very slowly.
Yes.
To go in at 7 kilowatts, which is baby stuff right now, is about 3 times as much as the average load of your average house now. Okay,
right.
That's a lot of power, and that's a nothing burger for a car. I mean, that's the 8 or 6 hour charger. I want to get the thing done in 15 minutes. That will require some upgrades.
Right, and so the issue that you get here is that, you know, when utilities originally planned where they're putting their transformers and other related distribution infrastructure. You know, they did that maybe 30 or 40 years ago for your subdivision. And now all of a sudden, if you have an electric vehicle come and start charging online, it's like your temporary houses are popping up, you know, in terms of how much demand they have. But to your point, there's no, you know, it's not advanced technology. You know, it could just be upsizing the transformer. There's nothing new there. It's just the simple matter of the fact that when the utility planned and put these transformers in place, they weren't thinking of, you know, using them like this. So different use and different lifespan. So,
and I might add, the phone and cable companies went through all that when they were allowed to pocket the profits, and not until. And the wireless companies did exactly the same thing.
Is the gentleman there?
Hi, I'm Terry Hathaway. Peter, you said earlier that the government has made many bad decisions with regards to future technologies. You used the example of synfuels. You could also use methanol, and compressed natural gas. But the current state of electric car technology, is that not kind of a payoff of the Partnership for a New Generation of Vehicles, the Advanced Battery Initiative, and maybe even the Freedom Car program?
I don't know. Did they? I mean, if you're talking about the tax subsidies on the Prius and so on, I have long bet, and I'm going to, if I'm going to be wrong, people will definitely be able to document it. I have believed that Japan and China, and I think China will go exactly. Japan has nothing. It has no fuel at all of natural resource. I mean, a bit of coal. I've long been quite certain that they would go aggressively toward EVs because there are various ways to. They were going to go heavily nuclear as well. Whether that will last, who knows? But I mean, countries that are and they're far away from the oil supplies and everything. And I don't know how much Toyota and the Prius and Honda's alternative were subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, but I suspect not all that much. I think they made a clear. I mean, Prius, as I understand it, means it's something that's Latin for forward-looking or the first. I don't think they ever expected the Prius to be they're investing for the future. They think they're going that way. As I said, Ford went that way. The light hybrids. There is lots of good economics, and $4 a gallon gas will make it very attractive for these first few steps. I'd like to see how much further we can get on that. But you know what? People will always say the government made it happen. All I can say is the governments are all bankrupt. You may have heard this, or at least and they're not going to. I mean, $10,000 batteries, 100 million cars. You're talking $1 trillion. Washington is not going to pay for that trillion. They're not going to pay for half of it. And I don't think the cost curves are going to plummet on batteries. They're very resource intensive. You've got very expensive raw materials in them. I'd love to be wrong. I mean, love to be wrong on lots of things.
In defense of the government, let me just jump in and this is I can say I'm from Washington and here to help. I guess it's all right. That if you look at electronics, microelectronics, and so forth, that almost every step of the way, either Bell Labs or the government played a critical role. It wasn't an isolated role. Sometimes they were. Gordon Moore, for instance, would point to the government as that first critical customer that really helped them get going. So I think one might look at the possibility that it's always getting the right pieces together that moves us forward. Synfuels. I'm trying to develop a theory that synfuels actually won the Cold War, but that's for another session.
Well, they weren't Jimmy Carter's synfuels because they never.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll tell you what synfuels were used in. Hitler drove his tanks on synfuels for his last 2 years.
South Africa developed.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, he had nothing else. So synfuels are not difficult to do, and engineers can turn raw energy into anything, and chemists as well. It just wasn't very economical.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to draw a clear connection between any particular government research, whether it's applied or fundamental research, and said, oh, if not for that, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, you could look at, there's many, laser, the internet. I mean, there's many things. It's difficult to say if that where people wanted it to go, or so maybe a topic for another panel someday in the future.
Gentleman from the Electrical Vehicle Association.
Of Greater Washington, D.C. Fast forward into the future, perhaps addressing the idea of what we'd call a smart car. Now, it'll be an electric, because the idea is that we'd have an intelligent, electrified grid interstate system or highway where you wouldn't have to worry about batteries. You'd get on it, and through whatever means, you would just use the grid to get you. You could go to your Starbucks, get what you want, and then say, hey, take me to L.A. or Miami, and punch in. And these are the machines that I think Virginia Tech, others, maybe Caltech, they're looking at these. Might even be MIT. I mean, after all, the Electric Vehicle Association of Greater Washington, D.C. has the MIT Aztec that it shows. This was a model vehicle. Might have been in your day there, Peter. No, it's probably in between when you started. Anyway, future cars, or what we'd call the electronic intelligent highway, that concept, if you'd address that.
I mean, you don't have to. If you walk right down, go take the elevator down and walk out to the Federal Triangle Station, and take the escalator, and you will see vehicles moving right this very minute, on a third rail, which is all electric and is pumping electric. Trams have run that way for 100 years. I might add that I believe it was in London early on, they had electric trolleys and they had rechangeable battery packs that, forklift would change them in and out. And in warehouses, people do this with forklifts themselves. They actually change out the battery pack. All of these things, one can imagine. I'll tell you, networks are very expensive to build, okay? And putting a third rail on all the highways would be quite expensive, which is what you're describing, a third rail. I might add that you're talking very large amounts of electricity here, and you're going to have some interesting safety challenges. I mean, charging batteries fast at high voltages has some interesting safety issues as well. I think they're perfectly solvable, but this is too far future for me to worry about right at this minute, but okay.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Peter that it's very far future. And also then there becomes the questions of trade-off, like whether you want to do that with electric vehicles or if we should be doing that with some other form of more centralized transportation, and it's something that urban studies people, are very interested in.
David Payton, and then we'll come back to you.
Let me give you a poor man's version of electric upgrades, and why isn't this good enough for a lot of purposes? So in neighborhoods, you have some new transformers. You buy an electric car, you let an electrician come out, make sure you have a 220 volt out to your exterior plug by your driveway. And Mr. PMI can upgrade a lot of his parking garages. He can do that now with conduit. I don't think you need to drill into a lot of concrete. Get 220 volt connections to a limited number of spaces. He pays a regular electrical charge. He charges the customers whatever he needs to in a monthly contract to recover and make a profit. Nothing is stopping any of that now, I don't think. Why do we need something?
Look, what we need is, depends, I guess, on what need means. Look, there's one group of entities in America today that has several $100 trillion of assets, a healthy balance sheet, and half the assets are sitting idle now, okay? If these guys had that problem, okay, they would be paying you to take the phone, all right? These are the guys who have the incentive to put out these charging stations, to put in that. I mean, if you give them the profit. Okay, there are lots of ways U.S. Air could fill its planes by having a secondary seller, who bought the whole aircraft wholesale and then somehow, put up the auction. But U.S. Air does it itself, and they have a bigger incentive than anybody else. Why would you tell United or U.S. Air, look, you guys have to charge a tariff price, which, by the way, was the law until Steve Breyer and Jimmy Carter and Fred Kahn changed that. This is a democratic change that basically accounts for our very low airfares today. The people with the greatest incentive and the money to do this are not secondary traders. Yes, you can always put an intermediary and tariff all this and then put an intermediary there. But then you have no incentive to upgrade the grid, to change the transformers, to put in the infrastructure. In fact, believe me, they are very good at slow rolling people. When people say, invest this in your grid, and they'll say, oh yes, well we'll work on this. Okay, I mean they have a negative incentive to invest in this infrastructure today. The people who actually own and control it, right? And I'd like to give them a positive incentive. I will say, as a matter of historic fact, my best guess is we would have had a broadband telecom network 10 or 15 years earlier if Washington had done what it ultimately did and said the broadband at above a certain speed and packet switched, which was easily distinguished from circuit switched or one-way coax cable, has said packet switched digital, high speed is on the computer side, not the network side. I think we'd have been 10 years earlier. And I think if Bell Labs had been allowed to take that transistor, which they got out of utility ratepayers, IBM would have had competition. We'd have been rolling out the mainframes about 10 years earlier. They were completely quarantined from building computers. They had the best computer designers in the country. They invented the transistor, and they weren't allowed to build any. And people said, well, we don't want to suck it into the utility. All right, suck it out of the utility. All right.
Well, you seem to be implying that even big parking garage operators would never see a business case for doing customer premises upgrades, and that basically they would need a monthly contract kind of deal from Pepco or someone like that to absorb the capitalization costs of the wiring of the parking
Pepco will
garages.
give it to it, but what's Pepco's incentive to give that to them? I mean, Pepco has an incentive to use it's the same incentive as United Airlines has to fill the empty seats on a jumbo jet. Nobody else has that. I mean, the owner of the asset is the primary. And if they're not sharing in the upside, they will think of lots of reasons to not do it. Okay, and I've seen it done, believe me. All right.
And I sympathize with them because when these things work out well, they get none of the upside, and when they crater, which they quite often do, there's no guarantee that electric cars are going to work. And if I were running their show and I'm accountable to shareholders, I'm going to go slow on this. I'm not going to get out ahead of the cars. I could lose my shirt, my shareholders' shirt. I'm going to stay behind. I think that's the rational economic thing to do, and I think that's unfortunate. You always have this problem with networks. You always have a first mover problem. These guys have solved it, and it's real easy. And they solved it when the regulators let them, not before.
I'm not sure the right panel to answer this, but the lithium-air battery, which some work is going on at MIT, I know, and IBM is has a very large project on it. Do you see any great potential for that to solve some of these problems?
You mean when you say problems, you refer to cost problem? Is that specific? Because there's
cost and range problems, because presumably they're going to be at least 5 times. They're going to be at least 5 times as efficient, or not efficient, have 5 times the capacity per weight as the current batteries, which will increase the range, also decrease the price.
Yeah, so I think it helps in general when we talk about questions of battery chemistry and what kind of battery chemistry we should be using. So what you mentioned, how much energy you can pack in, energy density. But there's also many other metrics that matter for like design metrics that matter for vehicles. Part of it has to do with lifespan, how fast it recharges, how those issues are affected by ambient temperature, maximum power output in a specific period of time, because some automotive applications need like a big pulse of energy. So there's many different chemistries that people are interested in. I think it's a matter of making sure that it's not just cost and it's not just energy density, it's many other things that you have to consider before you can say, oh, well, can it compete on price? I mean, first it has to compete on other metrics that automotive manufacturers have expressed an interest in.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I'm very scared when Washington says they're going to pay the way there, because I think lots of people will fail in this, and I'm delighted when markets have lots of failures around, because that's how because that's how people who believe in markets think you converge to the things that work. But if we have to subsidize our way there, Washington doesn't have the capital for this learning process. Nobody does except these guys.
David?
So you've been showing your wireless phone quite a bit, and in the wireless space there are 3 or 4, I think, still networks. But in the distribution of electricity, it seems like that is still monopoly. And so how do you deal with that in your vision?
Well, the interesting thing is, again, we do have an exact model for doing it. You can judge for yourself whether it was a good one or not. The phone companies faced exactly this issue, because the economies here are the shared asset. For a long time they were doing DSL. Some of them still are, over the copper wire. There was only one copper wire, okay, but they were certainly all of their backbone stuff above that. I mean, every bit of fiber. Verizon to this day. Some of you may have files from Verizon here in town, okay. All the backbone stuff, all the central offices, the whole lot. That's where the economies come from. That's what they what they want to get rich on, and that's why they hired my law firm and lots of others, and they spent, I don't know what the number is. These people spent in the billions of dollars changing the political scene. Okay, it was that entrenched, that difficult. Okay, but so how do we do it today? I mean, Verizon is using exactly the same wires in the backbone as our phone companies and cable companies, I might add, all over the place, all right, to carry both the regulated and the price deregulated traffic. Well, the answer is you have to hire a ton of accountants. That's the first part. They're expensive. Second, you know what the second part of the answer is? And I'll be the first to say it. There is no economically rigorous, correct way to price a shared asset. I mean, this has been proven as clearly as anything in the dismal science has ever been proven. If you have a shared economic, the least economically inefficient is something called Ramsey pricing, which is basically you soak the people who are least elastic and both need it, and you charge least to the most elastic. It's a technicality. You know what? You make a reasonable call. You have to do the same thing in the interstate networks, the very high voltage lines. They're hugely shared assets. I mean, nobody can possibly use that. But so you have to do it. But it's been done. Okay, it's an accounting problem. There's no perfect answer, but there are lots of reasonable and plausible ones, and you go with one.
You go with one because, an imperfect division between a regulated and a deregulated world is better than saying, because I can't do it, I'll leave it all regulated. Right?
Yeah. And it's funny that Peter brought up Ramsey pricing, because that's one of the methods that people will use during market liberalization or deregulation of monopoly electric utilities for figuring out who should pay and getting rid of stranded costs and things like that. I said this before, and I want to say it again, that moving to deregulation is a very complicated process. It doesn't happen fast. There's a lot of paperwork that has to get done, and setting up the ISO is hard. It's not an overnight process, so it takes some time. And it's more of an art than I would say a science.
And we've seen it done horrendously wrong in California, for example. I mean, because the big difference that Californians thought they could mimic this stuff, and there's in one key respect you definitely can't. I mean, the wires and the generation are very tightly linked in electricity. You just can't be huge amounts. With the packet switching network, you in fact were moving toward a technology that could largely unlink the stationary stuff and the switches from the wires. Okay? That was a big advantage. You could quickly decentralize things. With power, you can't do that. And California, astonishingly, didn't think this through sensibly. I mean, it was a debacle what they did. Go ahead.
Well, I guess I'm still confused. So I understand the point about generation and that side of the market, but you're talking about investments at the distribution level. That's who's got to make the investment for this stuff to work. And it seems to me, I mean, at least in the internet space now, there is a cable infrastructure and a wired infrastructure. I mean, there are multiple infrastructures, and I'm trying to understand, are you...
Well, to begin with, I mean, as I say, even if I don't doubt that the electric wires will remain a monopoly for a long time to come, okay? So I'll give you that. I don't think we're going to have 3 sets of wires. We got 2 sets of wires on the wireline data thing with considerable pain, okay? That required a lot of regulatory innovation back in the 60s and 70s, all right? So I will grant that right away. And I will also grant that if you're going to have a monopoly environment, there will be... People will insist that you not load the cost of charging, the fancy EVs on grandma, who just wants to plug in her toaster every morning. So you have to have a separation process. But all I'm telling you is these are accounting problems which are non-trivial. In fact, in a theoretical sense, they're impossible to get exactly right. But that practical people have in fact made calls on, and that one can make reasonable calls, sensible calls. And the advantage of doing so is you create a deregulated sphere. And so let's level on everything. I actually like the deregulated sphere because then it swallows the whole thing in the end. I mean, the broadband data networks are swallowing the voice and the video, right? I mean, they're all going to be swallowed into the broadband pipe. And I celebrate that, and it's good for grandma, too. She'll get even cheaper service from Skype, But that's longer term, right? Look, I'm not saying deregulate at all. I'm saying define something that is completely outside the old world and then find reasonable economic ways to put it in a competitive sphere.
Yeah, let me ask one last question, taking the prerogative of the moderator. We've talked a bit about battery technology and some advances that are on the drawing board. Where do you think battery technology might be 10 years from now? We have a revolution coming. We have something that replaces lithium? Or
First, let me say I'd love to be wrong. Secondly, lithium, most of the cost of lithium is lithium today, all right? And there are manufacturing costs and so on. I don't doubt the manufacturing cost will go down. I'd love to predict that the cost of lithium will drop. There's a bottomless well for lithium, I gather, in Afghanistan or something. But it's going to, whether we get it here remains to be seen. I am less optimistic than I wish I were. Okay, I don't see economies of batteries sort of following a chip trajectory. I'd love to be wrong. Go ahead, prove me wrong. Right? If we are, these guys will find it. They want you to have batteries. They want you to have batteries more than anything. Right?
Max, are we going to have a Gordon Moore in battery world?
Well, I'm going to put this slide up again. This one right here, where we see everybody trying to guess. How much batteries cost, and you can see there's many people have different opinions, and especially if you have a vested interest in certain other technologies, fuel cells, for instance. I think it's hard to say where batteries are going. And again, what I would say in general, I'm not a material scientist, so take what I say with a lot of salt. I think that it depends on what kind of battery you're using. So if you're talking batteries for stationary storage, like, megawatt hour capacity, that's different. If you're talking In this case, batteries for vehicles, that's a different story. But that's an excellent question. I think maybe another topic, yeah.
A future panel.
Yeah.
Well, we have reached our witching hour. I want to thank Peter and Max for two very thought-provoking presentations, and thank you all for an excellent set of questions. We will continue to look at this subject, and maybe we'll persuade Peter to come back without a 6-year hiatus. Please join me in a round of applause for this very interesting panel.
I'm in Hanover. Not in Southern, but nice country. Thank you very much for inviting me.
What's that? The intermittent renewables one? I have to ask Melanie if I could come. I want to come.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed the last time here. It's easy to.
Wait, yeah, next Wednesday. No, that's not Hog anymore, is it? I mean, no. No, that is more. Right? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But, if I come up that morning, the first question and the question is it worth coming on?
Yes, that's a very. I was.
Right.
So I haven't decided.
Okay.
It may be that the topic is of enough importance that I'm actually going to be involved in something else tomorrow.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll be back tonight.
Hi, how's it going? Yes, President Wilson will be here at 4 p.m. I assume you're the representative from Australia.
I am one of the representatives of the press corps.
Press corps. Okay, feel free to make yourself at home. One of the program people should be here shortly. That's okay, yeah. Make yourself comfortable.
the slides are working?
Make yourself comfortable, Bruce.
Yeah, I will do.
All right.
How are you? Good. Chris Barrett. Oh, hi, Chris. Nice to meet you. David. Yeah, David. Yeah. Are you over here with the treasurer, or you're over here?
No, I'm here. I'm in the permanent.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's great. Congratulations. Thanks very much. Really good.
Yeah, it's good fun.
On today.
And it's your paper where all that.
My paper, yeah,
Stuck
that's
into?
right. Yeah, absolutely. We're getting some I hope I'm stuck into, but yes, indeed.
Sticky.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to check that everything's working. Welcome.